Hey, Bastish B here for 64K and welcome to another new episode of Compilation Nation. And if you've never watched this show before, basically I go through an old video game compilation, the ones they used to put out in the 80s and early 90s, and we're going to go through all the games in there and check them all out. And today's compilation is going to be Data East's Arcade Alley on the Commodore 64. So before we get going, let's take a quick look at the box and the contents. Okay, so here it is, the 6-game collection that is Data East's Arcade Alley. You got Tag Team Wrestling, Breakthrough, Kung Fu Master, Karate Champ, Express Raider, and Last Mission. That's a pretty diverse selection of arcade conversions, and this was distributed by US Gold in Europe. And on the first cassette here, we got Kung Fu Master, Breakthrough, and Karate Champ, and the second one we got Express Raider, Last Mission, and Tag Team Wrestling. And now let's start checking out all these games. So we're going to jump into the pack's heavy hitter first, Kung Fu Master, which was released in the arcades in 1984. This game was a massive success at that time. There literally wasn't an arcade I went into that didn't have this game. I'll be covering the arcade version in more detail in an episode of Player One Memory, so look out for that. So for now, we'll jump on over to 1985's C64 release, which was done by Berkeley Softworks, who also did another one on this compilation, namely Karate Champ. Kung Fu Master was a side-scrolling beat-em-up that alternated between going right to left and then left to right for each of its 5 levels. Your goal was to reach the top of the tower and rescue your girlfriend Sylvia. You know, that old chestnut. The action is really quick and intense, with bad guys constantly coming at you in a variety of styles, from mindless thugs, midgets to knife-wielding maniacs, and end-of-the-level bosses decked out with their own weapons. Some levels have traps and other devices to dodge and weave your way through. As far as conversions go, it's really good. The graphics are admittedly pretty chunky, but the gameplay is captured very well, and even though you have to press the spacebar to switch between punches and kicks, it still plays remarkably good. The music captures that constant beat of the arcade, and even all the tricks you use in that version can be applied here to progress. I think Berkeley did a very impressive job with this one, and Zap64 magazine gave it an overall 79%. And if you're tired of all this kung fu fighting, you could always just pull out a gun and go all Chuck Bronson on all these dudes. I'm sure Data East just loved that little Easter egg of a cheat. For our next game, we're going to take the plunge and get this compilation's worst game out of the way, namely Breakthrough, which was released in the arcades in 1986. Holy moly, is this a piece of hot garbage of a conversion. Granted, the arcade is obviously not the most memorable as well, but damn, this looks like it was programmed by a 5-year-old on a VIC-20. The arcade itself was a side-scrolling shooter of sorts where you drove your Jeep through 5 levels, just blasting and jumping over obstacles. It's a pretty forgettable arcade game, and it's strange they even decided to convert it, as it's kinda mediocre at best. The results though are amateur hour in full effect. I love how there isn't even a main title menu. The game just starts on a blank screen as you ride in, and they didn't even know how to start the game, as you can see by the screen. Sound effects are awful and annoying. The graphics are massive, ugly, chunky mess with really poor animation and mundane backgrounds. You just shoot anything and press the spacebar to jump over obstacles. This game reminds me of the time I bought the C64 conversion of Jailbreak. I loaded that up with anticipation and was just completely crushed by its amateur hour conversion. This, however, is even worse than that, which you can almost not believe. The arcade was never really worth converting in the first place, but this could have easily been done on the C64 quite well. As it stands though, it's the bottom of the barrel of this compilation, with Zap64 giving it a paltry 19%, saying it's an absolute waste of time and money. Overall, that pretty much says everything about this game. Tag Team Wrestling was next, based on a really obscure 1983 arcade game by Technos, and quite a few games on this list were only distributed by Data East and not actually made by them. RM's Kung Fu Master is another example. And back to 1987's conversion of Tag Team Wrestling to the C64, and it's a bit of a mess that I honestly still quite enjoy playing. Is it good? Not really, but I still always had fun with it regardless. It's a pretty quick-paced tag team wrestling game with a sort of fast-paced menu-driven interface interface for moves. Everything plays out very quickly and the moves are very easy to pull off, and the matches are short, so in that respect it's quite fun to play. Sometimes though it almost doesn't even feel like you are actually in control of the game and it feels like it's just playing out some sort of weird demo mode. It's pretty strange. The game's graphics do a decent job of its arcade counterpart and are nothing to write home about, with very minimal animation. The music though is extremely dull and depressing, sounding like it was recorded 2 minutes before somebody suicided themselves. As for gameplay goes, it's pretty easy to get used to and play, even though it feels pretty unorthodox. Zap absolutely hated this game, giving it 25% overall, saying, "Fine example of the beat 'em up genre at its very worst." Well, it's definitely not that bad. I've played way worse than this, but there are definitely better wrestling games on the C64 to check out first, like Championship Wrestling by Epix or my favorite, Rock and Wrestle by Melbourne House. Last Mission is up next and is a multi-directional shooter based on an arcade game from 1986. The arcade game was sort of a variation on Konami's Time Pilot, with fast shooting gameplay as you try to rid your planet of a full-on alien invasion. You use the map in the bottom of the screen to take out specific targets, and a bar lets you know how many bad guys you've destroyed, and when both goals are hit, it's on to the next level. This is a quick and cool C64 conversion despite popular opinion. It's not the greatest looking game, but the arcade is still intact with its fast-paced gameplay, massive power-ups, and David Whittaker offering up a brilliant, better than the arcade version of the main theme music, which is absolutely awesome. This game can be really tough though, so getting those power-ups is key to surviving that first 20 seconds. Once you have a shield and almost any power-up, and make sure you are careful, the levels can be destroyed fairly easily. You're gonna need some pretty quick reflexes though to survive right to the end. But I enjoyed this conversion a lot and loaded this game up a lot until I finally beat it. Zap64 magazine didn't enjoy this one either, giving it a paltry 49% overall, saying it never really reaches its full potential and is just an average arcade conversion. In fact, they pretty much hated everything besides Kung Fu Master, but I think overall it's a pretty decent shoot 'em up that's worth looking at. Next was my second favorite game on this compilation, being Express Raider, based on the 1986 arcade game. I played this arcade every time I saw it. I mean, cowboys and video games were a pretty rare combination back then. It was usually always spaceships or ninjas for a lot of the 80s, but Express was just so much fun. Fight your way to the front of the train, take out all the henchmen and rob the train. Wait a minute. Were you the bad guy? I never even realized that until I replayed this. As with Kung Fu Master, this conversion features some really chunky looking graphics, but they still managed to get the gameplay spot on just like the arcade. It's essentially a beat 'em up with some dodging and light jumping elements, and there's also those on-horse shooter stages which are really fun to break up the monotony a little bit. I like the variety of enemies, from dogs, brawlers, guys with guns. Each one needs a new tactic to take down. The energy system is also pretty interesting, which is like a game of tug of war, as each hit gets the bad guy, or the good guy, I guess, closer to death, but if he gets you, the energy starts swaying back in the opposite direction. You're also on a timer, as there's a bomb that blows the carriages apart, so if you take too long, you're going to be history. Sound is good with some decent sound effects, but the gameplay is very on point. Zap64 didn't think this game was really that good either, giving it a meager 60%. I'm starting to think somebody over there had a beef with Data East, because this is honestly a really fun game to play and totally worth checking out. And on to game number 6, the last in this compilation, which was Karate Champ, based on the 1984 arcade game by Technos. This was also a pretty popular machine I often came across back then. It had a bizarre 2-joystick control scheme, which was unlike any game I'd ever played. It's essentially the grandfather of versus fighting games. It may not have been the first, but a lot of tropes and techniques in this game have been carried over to fighting games ever since. Berkeley Softworks did the conversion for this one, and I think they did a pretty decent job at it. The game's style is way more realistic and tournament based, with its one hit taking out an opponent and awarding a point, much like Melbourne House's Way of the Exploding Fist. The slow paced nature of the fights may put some people off, but it does feel a little bit more strategic, and timing is key to winning. The graphics are a lot closer to the arcade in style in Kung Fu Master, with decent animation. Sound effects are pretty basic, but all the arcade's digitized speech has been unfortunately omitted. The controls take a little getting used to for the C64 version. Obviously it only uses one controller, so the game does feel a lot different than the arcade, but plays fairly well once you figure it out. This is another game that Zap absolutely hated, giving it a 52% overall, saying a mediocre arcade conversion of a dated and uninspiring arcade game. Holy cow, they were really harsh back then. There are definitely vastly superior games in this genre on the C64, like the aforementioned Exploding Fist and International Karate, just to name a few. But it is still a decent entry and is definitely the inspiration for most of those games that came after it. Okay, so in conclusion, this compilation is pretty flawed. On the high end, you got Kung Fu Master and Express Raider. At least in my opinion, those are excellent games. I just love them. And then on the low end, you've got Breakthrough, which is absolutely awful, and Tag Team Wrestling, which is not very good, even though I personally had a lot of fun with it. And then you got some middle ground games, Karate Champ and Last Mission, which I think are good, but you know, they're not going to blow anybody away or change your opinion about anything. So overall, it's pretty flawed, but I have a whole lot of nostalgia for this, just loading it up so many times, and I still love it. And thanks for joining me, Bassish B, for another episode of Compilation Nation. If you want to see more like that, I've got a whole bunch of other episodes in the series, so please check it out. And if you can like and subscribe, that will be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.